Our scripture this morning is from Luke chapter 6. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. Do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Forgive, and you will be forgiven. Give, and it will be given to you. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over, will be poured into your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. He also told them this parable. Can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? The student is not above the teacher, but everyone who is fully trained will be like their teacher. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, "Brother, let me take the speck out of your eye," when you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the plank out of your eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. This is the word of the Lord.
How would you personally define the successful life? That was a question that was posed to many people, and two options were given. The first is that a successful person is someone who has followed their own talents and their interests to become the best that they can be at whatever it is they care about. So that's one possibility of the successful person. The second is a person is successful if they are rich, or if they have an important career or are well known. So which of those would you say personally, that's how I would define the successful life? And then the second question to think about right now is, what do you think most other people would choose between those two? So which would you choose, and what do you think most other people would choose? Now, I have a hunch about how you would answer that, and it's because when 5,500 people were asked this question in a survey, 97% of people said they would define the successful life as following your interests, developing them as best as you can. 97% of people said, that's what I think between those two is the successful life. And 92% of them said most other people would choose the other one. So if you sat there and thought, I think success is following my heart, developing my talents, but I suspect that most other people think it's get rich and be successful and be well known. Well, then what you have said is what so many of us say, well, this is my definition, but the reality is I'm kind of judging other people because I don't think their definition is as good as mine. We love to judge. It is a default disposition for our hearts that we judge. As I was thinking about this sermon this week, and I just did a little experiment, I thought, okay, where do I judge typically? And I was somewhat concerned with how easily and lengthy the list came to me. So I live a few blocks of here north on Delaware. I all the time judge people who are driving too fast down Delaware Street. And speaking of driving, I judge other people when I'm on the road and they're weaving in and out of traffic and they're driving faster than they should, except of course when I do it because I have to get somewhere that's significant and I'm running late. I judge people who judge me for how much I love Diet Dr. Pepper. And I know that there are some of you here who fit that bill. I judge people who answer their email at the wrong time of day, too late at night or too early in the morning. Except when I do it and I just schedule it to go later. I judge when I get into the supermarket and I'm judging and I'm like, how in the world, who is so dumb that organized it like this, that they haven't put things where it should be? And then I get to the front and I'm like, I can't believe that I have to check myself out and do more work and the greediness of supermarket owners. But if somebody is there to check me out, I can't believe that they can't focus and do the job faster. We love to judge. One person, in fact, has said, you and I are like wandering judges. Like we're walking our way through life just looking for things that we can be judgmental about. And if you're like, well, I still don't feel it, let me try to hit even closer to home. Parenting. Even before your child is born, do you think I would like to have a home birth or a hospital birth? Will I use an epidural or natural? And how am I going to approach this? Am I going to breastfeed or formula? Cloth diapers or disposable diapers? Plastic toys or wooden toys? And then when you start feeding, are you going to make your own food? Are you going to buy it from the store? Is it going to be organic or is it going to be processed? And it's legitimate to have an opinion about those questions, and even if you're not a parent, you probably do. And you may have found yourself thinking in some of those yes to one, and if you're honest, you have a sense of, and if you've chosen otherwise, well, then you're in the wrong. In fact, we are so fond of judging, particularly when it comes to parenting. There was a story of a woman in Oregon. And she went to the store and just needed to grab like milk and a few things. And so she thought, I'll be in a hurry. She left her car running in the parking lot. A guy walks by, observes it, and the crime of opportunity seizes him. He jumps in the car, drives off, and then realizes the reason that she left the car running is there's a 4-year-old in the back seat. So he returns the car to the parking lot, encounters the woman, and then proceeds to lecture her about her bad parenting and threatens to call the police on her. He gives her back her 4-year-old and steals the car a second time. That is how much we love to judge. So the question is, why? Why do we judge? Or to put it in the connected things that Jesus also addresses here that we heard this morning, why don't we forgive? Why do we set ourselves up as the authoritative go-to? Why do we put ourselves forward as the speck puller from other people's eyes? Why do we judge so much? I think part of it is that we are looking to divert attention from ourselves. That we know when we reflect, we recognize our failures and we feel insecure about them. And that if I could judge, then it deflects, it hides, it diverts the attention from me and my failure, my flaws, and it puts it somewhere else. And I think this is part of the reason Jesus says, you hypocrites. You hypocrites, there is this distance between how you are projecting and how you actually are. And that word hypocrite is actually, it's a transliteration directly from the Greek word, and the Greek word had to do with actors. And in Greco-Roman theater, an actor wore a mask in order to project to the audience, this is the emotion that this character feels. So happiness or sadness or anger. And it didn't matter what the actor on the inside, what their facial expression was, because it was the mask that people could see. And Jesus is saying it is that distance between what you project and what's actually on the inside that is going on when you are judging. And yet it actually goes even further than that. Because Jesus doesn't just say, you hypocrite. Notice there in verse 42, he also says, you yourself fail to see the plank in your own eyes. So Jesus is saying it's not just, oh, you know your flaws and you're aware of them and you are consciously judging somebody to distract. He's like, you don't even see it. You actually can't see and understand your own sin and your own problems. I don't see it. And part of the judging is hiding itself, not just from you, but from my own view. That is the gap. That's how deep it goes, is that I don't see the reality and the enormity of my sin, and that judging is one of the ways in which I am distracting or hiding and failing to see the reality of my own heart. Because I'm fond, Jesus says, of thinking about my sin as if it is a speck, when actually, Jesus says it's more like a beam. And the image here for us is actually like this. The plank that he means is the beam that you would use as the load-bearing timber for building a house. That is how significant Jesus says my sin actually is. It is like a huge plank that you use to build and hold up a whole house. Jesus says this is the reality of where your sin actually is. And judging is both not seeing it and trying not to see it at the same time. We are this weird overlap. We know we're sinful, and we don't know how sinful we really are. We're truth suppressors trying to hide the reality from ourselves. And so what do we do with that? What do we do with this reality? I think it's significant that Jesus starts this section with actually the positive first. Look at verse 36. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. I had, in my old church, when I led small groups, one of the small group leaders was a brigadier general. And he wrote me an email, and the first time he did, I was like, oh, this is really interesting, because he had this little thing that he called bottom line up front. And so it was a longer email, but he helped me digest it, because he was like, here are the bullet points right at the top of the email. Here's my bottom line up front. This is Jesus's approach for our hearts this morning. He says, here is the bottom line up front. You have been shown mercy. Your Father has a merciful heart, and your Father has shown you mercy. And that, he says, is the key that goes in and unlocks our hearts and our judging. Because if you know that you have received mercy, then it means you know your sin. Mercy is that we don't get what we deserve. Grace is paired with it. Grace is that we get what we don't deserve. And both of those are in view here as Jesus talks. And both of them emphasize, this is the reality of my sin. And yet here's the amazing, overwhelming response of my Father. So Jesus is saying, be merciful because you've received mercy. Now Jesus says, let me talk to you about how you express that mercy. Let me put flesh for you on what it means to show mercy. And that is where he goes when he then begins to talk about judging and about who's our authoritative guide and about how do we interact with somebody else's sin. So let's unpack that a little bit this morning. Let's put flesh on this, not strictly as 3 points, because they're not going to be equal in length, but all of it, this sense of how do we get at recognizing, how do we become people who operate from a position of needing mercy and having received mercy, and what that means then for each other. So first, Jesus says there in verse 37, he says, do not judge, and you will not be judged. Do not condemn, and you will not be condemned. Now, what does that mean, not to judge? Jesus, at some level, does things that are judging. Even in this very sermon, he says there are things that are evil. And there are people who are sinful. And in one of the next stories in Luke's gospel, Jesus is going to sit there with Simon the Pharisee, and he is to Simon's face going to call him out about his sin. So Jesus, I don't think, is saying, man, you can't discern between right and wrong. You can't say that some things are good and some things are evil. But Jesus is saying, how do you do that? Don't be judgmental. Don't have this heart posture of looking down on people. Don't be so quick to criticize and to put yourself above somebody else. Being judgmental is saying, you know what, that issue people could disagree on. Different people see it different ways, but I'm going to make it a moral issue, and I'm going to put myself in the right place, and I'm going to look down on people who are elsewhere. Being judgmental is when we keep our distance from other people, particularly brothers and sisters who are Christians, and we keep our distance because, well, things are messy and problematic, and the way that they approach things, well, man, I don't want to get myself sucked in there. Being judgmental is when we are confident that we can read other people's motives. This is a big one. We see on the outside and we feel confident that we know what's going on the inside and that we can discern why somebody did that, what their intent is, what their motives were. And I think that's what Jesus is speaking to here when he says, do not judge. It is the ability to distinguish and say, this action is wrong, but not to say, you're wrong. As if we are writing somebody off. You're lost. You're hopeless. There's no chance. There's nothing. You're damned. You're beyond help and redemption. That, I think, is so often where our hearts go when we are judging, and that's what Jesus is speaking against, and he's saying, if you have received mercy, that's not where your heart goes. There was a woman, Courtney, who was driving back from New Jersey where she had been visiting her mother-in-law. She had her 4-year-old with her. And on the way back to New York City, she knew that there was a store that she wanted to stop at in order to buy a gate for her fireplace. That her 4-year-old was beginning to be curious, and she was worried about what that would mean for the danger of the fireplace. And so she thought, this is the right place for me to stop to get this. 5 minutes before she gets there, the 4-year-old falls asleep in the car. And so then she's like, okay, what do I do? The daughter's a little bit sick, and she's thinking, okay, I know exactly what I need. So she parks, it's about 70 degrees outside. She parks in the shade, puts the windows down slightly, locks the car, and then goes in order to get this. She comes out no more than 10 minutes later, and standing out in front of her car there is a woman and like 2 store employees on either side. And at first she panics and thinks, oh no, what's happened? What's wrong? And she comes to the car, but she looks, her daughter's there, still asleep. Everything is fine. And these people don't say anything. And so she's slightly weirded out by it, but she gets in the car and proceeds home, drives back to New York City, tells her husband about it that night. A couple days later, he's down in the lobby of the building where they live, and a police officer approaches him and asks him, are you Courtney's husband? Yes. He's like, okay, here's this card. She needs to call the police in New Jersey. They want to talk to her. So she calls and turns into a 30-minute interview, at the end of which the officer says, I am 90% sure you are going to be charged. And she is brought up on charges of felony child endangerment and classified as a violent family offender. And eventually this makes its way, tons of delays through the court system, but eventually she is put on a year of probation supervised. And so once a month she has to drive 100 miles to meet with a probation officer. Well, here's the point of this. She gets there for her first interview thinking, it's going to be these kinds of questions, and instead, the first question the probation officer asks her is, what do you do? And she says, well, I'm a stay-at-home mom. And she said, that's when the whole thing turned nasty. She said, the woman asked her, well, how does your husband feel about all this? Is he okay with you abandoning your infant in a car while he's working to support you? And she's like, no, that's not what happened at all. Like, my daughter's not an infant. She's 4 years old. It wasn't hot. I took all of these safety precautions. It was just a few minutes, and the officer, she said, shook her head, tightened her lips, and looked Courtney firmly in the eye. I would never do that, she said, ever. And that is the heart that writes somebody off, that says, you're wrong, you're hopeless, you're damned. And that is the heart that Jesus comes to change and to save. That is the heart where Jesus says, here is my Father's heart, not like that, but of mercy. And so if we have received mercy, then we recognize our sin. We recognize our own baggage and damage and sin and rebellion and wrongdoing, and it softens us. And it levels the playing field. Oh, what ground do I have to stand on to look down on somebody else when I'm at the foot of the cross as one for whom Jesus had to die? Jesus says, you have received mercy, so your heart isn't to judge. Instead, he says, your heart is to forgive. Your heart is to give. You have received mercy, now extend that to others. And notice the language here, this passive, forgive and you will be forgiven. Judge, don't judge and you won't be judged. And that is what is called a divine passive, where they use a passive verb, and what stands in is, it's implied, it's God who will do that. So it's saying, don't judge and God won't judge you. Forgive and God will forgive you. It's this idea that God applies the same standard to us that we apply. And that here is actually meant not as a threat, but as a promise of blessing. It's saying, like, if your heart moves toward mercy, God's heart moves toward mercy. That God uses that same standard, and that's good, Jesus is saying. God won't look down on you. God won't have a heart of condemning towards you. And there's this image here of what does it mean for God to give generously there in verse 38. A good measure, pressed down, shaken together, and running over will be poured into your lap. And my hunch is you're like, huh? That must mean something, but it doesn't mean anything to me. So it's very much an image of the time. So one writer says that when it came time to measure grain, so somebody you'd squat down and you'd have this measure, and you'd fill it about 3/4 full of grain, and then you would take it and you'd shake it to get it to settle down, to pack down. And then you would take and you'd put the other last quarter in, and it'd be filled. You'd shake it again. You'd take your hands and you'd press it down. You'd then put as much as you could in it. Then you have a full measure. And this idea of the lap is you're wearing a cloak and you hold it out. Think of like a dress. You'd hold it out as if to form a pocket, and somebody then pours grain into it, and they keep pouring grain into it. And the measure is full and it's overflowing, and you're sitting there and you're trying to figure out, how do I capture all of the grains? That sense of abundance. That sense of here's what you need and then some, that's God's heart. That is God's heart of generosity and of grace and of forgiveness. This is about God's movement toward us in our sin. God's grace and his mercy, that's his heart. And that's the heart then he wants us to believe and to live and to see our sin so that we can see his mercy. So that's a key way that we who have received mercy express mercy, is that we don't judge. But it also, Jesus says, has to do with who is the authority. So he says here, can the blind lead the blind? Will they not both fall into a pit? Now, I don't think he's talking here about false teaching, though he warns about that other places, but the context here doesn't seem like that. Instead, I think Jesus is saying, here is a warning about not trusting your own insight. Don't sit there and put yourself up as an authority, as a guide, because Jesus says you need mercy. If you've received mercy, it means that you have sin, and if you are sinful, it means your judgment is distorted. Your insight is only partial at best. you should be really careful and humble about what it means to put yourself forward as a guide, to say to other people, hey, I've got this figured out. Listen to me, follow me. And I think one of the ways that plays out is, are there ways and places that we are tempted to sit in judgment upon Jesus? That we look and hear what Jesus says and we think, okay, well, that made sense for your time and for that situation, but we're a lot further along. We know better now. Like, we understand things better about money than you did, Jesus. Or we understand things better about our bodies and our sexual desire than you did, Jesus. And I'm the authority on this, not you. Or it's about, like, how do we think carefully about not claiming authority too high for ourselves? So I was sitting on my front porch this week. I was working on this sermon, had the windows open, and I hear like shouts, and it sounds like kids playing, and I was intrigued. It's the middle of the day during school, and so I look up to see, and I realize, oh, this isn't kids that I'm hearing, but there's a car that's parked across the street. The window is down, and there's a woman in there, and she is screaming and like agitated, unsettled, yelling. And immediately I'm looking and thinking, what's wrong? And I realize, okay, there's nobody in the car with her. So it doesn't feel like there's an immediate danger. So I'm sitting there trying to think through, okay, what do I do? Is this a place to try to help? And because I was thinking about this sermon, I'm in the middle of reading and thinking about this passage, my heart was moved to begin to pray. And I just thought, God, I don't know what's going on, but that must be hard. For her to be so worked up, that must mean things look bad. And I feel for her, I feel for the person on the other end of the phone, and I'm praying and I'm thinking about this, and suddenly the thought comes to me, man, I'm really applying this passage well. And in that moment, I am reminded of my own sin and of my overconfidence, and I realize I need the grace of this passage even as I'm applying this passage. That somehow I've got this insight. No, you don't. That's the heart that all of us need to have, even as we say, yes, Jesus, I'll follow you. And we could say sometimes rightly with Paul, follow me as I follow Jesus. There's nothing wrong with that. Jesus is the authority. But man, what does it mean to follow Jesus? It means to be somebody who's received mercy. And to be humble and even slightly suspicious about our own hearts. So Jesus says you express and you show mercy by not judging, by not making yourself the authority. And he says you show mercy and as one who has received mercy by not putting yourself forward as some beam extractor before you have dealt with your own sin. I don't think Jesus is saying, man, you can't say anything to anybody else because you have sin. Jesus isn't saying, man, you don't have any business pulling or helping somebody else, but he is saying, first, see the enormity of your sin. Recognize the beam of your sin, such that it's as if the sin that you have is so great, it's like it's only a speck in somebody else's eye. But obviously that person should be thinking of the beam in their eye. All of us have a beam of sin. The question is, do I prioritize my need and the reality of my sin? And I don't try to minimize it, and I don't try to underplay it. And I don't somehow think, man, I can self-improve my way out of this. No, I have to live as one whose sin is only dealt with by mercy. And am I serious about fighting my own sin? Before I say anything to somebody else, am I committed? Not because I'm getting it right or not because I'm perfect, but because my heart, though stumbling, is oriented toward trusting Jesus and saying, Spirit, work in me. And if those things are true, then Jesus says, tremblingly, humbly, then yes, go there with your brother or sister, slowly, humbly, not judging, but trying to walk alongside them. Tim Keller said this. He said, when you know you're sinful and yet you are utterly loved, then you will have both the humility and the confidence to try to pull the speck out of somebody else's eye. Only if you are believing the gospel and it tells you the reality utterly of your sinfulness and the overwhelming goodness of Jesus' love for you, if you hold those together, then it will both humble you and embolden you to be able to walk with somebody else. So what are a few ways for us to live this out? Now, the first is this: do you want to judge less? That I would advise that you confess more. If you want to judge other people less, then get into a place and a posture where you are confessing your sin as much as you can. And if you are really going there and humbling yourself, it will have the effect of reminding you of the reality of your sin and the overwhelming grace that has been poured out, spilling over out of your pockets, out onto the ground. As we turn and receive mercy and remember that we are sinners and that we need mercy all the way down, our hearts will judge less. Maybe there are people who are trying to help you with the speck in your eye, and you're realizing and you need to say, yeah, I need that help. Or maybe there are people that you should help with the speck in their eye, but you're scared. Or maybe there are people that you have tried to help and you've done it in a heart more judging and self-righteously, and you need to repent. Finish with this story. So I have a friend, a good friend for many years, who not here in Indianapolis, but where I have been before. And since I've moved away, my friend's marriage fell apart. And it fell apart in one of those awful ways that is not like the ordinary breaking down of marriage, but like the awfulness of his wife coming to very different places in terms of her faith. And there's a complicated, complex story of why that is. Really significantly reshaping, how does she see Jesus? How does she see herself? How does she see the commitments and the marriage vow that she had made? And she walked away from the marriage. Said no to those promises and to those vows in ways that felt deeply betraying for my friend. And on the night that the day that the divorce became final, the day that my friend realized, I need to take my wedding ring off. And he was sitting at home, not at home, he was over with some friends, mutual friends. And what do you think your heart is in that moment? In the midst of the rawness and the reality of this is done. It's not the story I wanted. It's not where I want my life to be. And this is where it is. And he said, you know what? My story with her is done, but her story isn't. God's not done with her yet. In a way that was humble, that wasn't looking to judge, that wasn't looking to condemn, that wasn't looking to say, oh my gosh, she has so wronged me. But in a merciful way of, God, you're still up to something here. I don't know what that is. I don't know where you're going to go with it, but I'm going to trust that you're still at work. That is a heart that knows, man, I've brought baggage into this. This has happened and it's not in a vacuum. But God, I'm going to believe that you are merciful, and that you are merciful first and foremost to me, so that in turn my heart can be merciful to others. Let's pray together. Jesus, that's the heart that we need you to be at work in us to create. Lord, help us to see our sin not so that we can just say, that we can in some false way put ourselves down, but so that we can reckon in a real way with our brokenness, not just our brokenness as if somebody else has done it, but with our own rebellion and treachery and hatred of you and putting other things in your place. And in that, Lord, would you 10 times more show us your mercy? So yes, help us to confess more, but help us to confess more so that all the more your grace will superabound where we recognize our sin abounds. And therefore, Lord, out of that heart that's received mercy, that still needs mercy, open our hands, turn our hearts away from looking down on other people, judging them, thinking that we're somehow superior. Look at me. Help us instead, humbly, lovingly, to confess and to be open and to look for your mercy and to be, as you would lead us, vehicles, channels for your mercy to others. We ask Jesus in your name. Amen.